Good evening, everyone. Actually, it's not evening, depending where you are. It is evening on the East Coast, but we're gathered here from really all around the world. It's good afternoon where I am. I want to continue the discussion from last night. On the talk last night, I really was in two pieces. The first was talking about the goal within the Theravada tradition of liberation through non-clinging. And we explored, what do we really mean by that, and different ways of holding it and relating to that idea. And then moved into this big topic of samadhi, concentration. Talked about some of the ways it can, we can aim it and it can unfold, and how it can relate to liberation through non-clinging. And then the meditation instructions this morning are, we had a lot of concepts last night, but the instructions are meant to be very, very not complicated, actually, and actually simple. So hopefully you're starting to get a feeling of that from this morning in the instructions. Just to give you an idea of the trajectory, so there was a focus last night on samadhi. Tomorrow night, tomorrow afternoon, the talk will be focusing on insight, which is the kind of the other piece in our meditation practice. And then again, we'll explore a range of ways we understand, like, what do we mean by insight? It's actually, there is a sort of the classic traditional view, but it's actually a lot of forms it can take, a lot of ways insight can manifest, and then some of the ways we practice insight, and then in particular, how do we connect the insight meditation with samadhi? And so that'll be tomorrow night. So today is really meant to be a bridge of continuing the same theme, picking up on the samadhi and really kind of carrying it through on the insight side. And to do that, I want to back up for a moment and just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the the original teachings that are preserved in the old Pali texts. I'm just going to do this a little bit. We don't want to get off into the concepts too much, but there's a few things here I think will be very helpful to apply directly to our practice. And according to tradition, there are these three talks that the Buddha gave, the very first Dharma talks he ever gave. Of course, we don't really know what the first talks were, but regardless of whether these are literally the first talks the Buddha gave or not, certainly it shows the importance and the prominence that the tradition puts on these teachings to put them as hold them as the first talk. So I want to just hang out here just a bit. In order to understand these, I'm going to bring in a concept that some of you know, but it's what you'll hear the term called the five aggregates. And that's a big topic, but basically it's just a way of talking about our own minds and bodies and relating to the nature of our own selves. And it basically breaks down or deconstructs ourself into five pieces. I don't know why these particular five groups were of sort of teasing apart what's the nature of our being. I don't know why they came with this particular grouping. You could have done it a lot of different ways. And you don't have to remember the details. I just want you to remember, don't try to memorize the five if you don't know them, but I just want you to understand the concept of what it's talking about. And why the model could be useful. So the five aggregates in Pali, the word is kunda, and it means heaps or aggregates. But sometimes you'll hear it as five heaps of something. So it's heaps of what? You'll also hear the term nama rupa, which means name and form, and it just means mind and body. So of the five aggregates, I'm going to name them very briefly. The first is the physical form, the body. And the other four all the mental part of our experience or of our being. And they're basically, one is what's called Vedana. It just means all our experiences are either pleasant or unpleasant or kind of in between. Sometimes people will say neutral, but we mean it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Neutral is just a shorthand. So there's the Vedana, the pleasantness, unpleasantness. There's what's called perception, which is just the ability of the mind to assemble sense input and kind of create our experience of the world around it. Actually, it may be interesting to you to just pause for a moment. I like this experiment myself. I'm going to hold something up to the camera here. And most of you recognize, and usually if we were doing this live and I could do question and answer, I would ask people what you see. And of course, people are going to say they see a bell or bowl. That's what we would all say. Actually, you don't see a bell. What's happening is lights and color and shape is falling on your retina. And your mind, when it has this particular pattern of light and colors, assembles that and says bell, but you don't actually see a bell. You create that experience. And so depending on what the video screen you're looking at right now, you may be seeing me sitting here, or you may have the gallery view, or you have thumbnails of everyone. You're having certain images, and in your mind, it happens instantaneously, but you know that's, oh, I recognize that person, that, or if you're looking at me, there's some flowers in the back, whatever. But we're creating that, we're assembling that together. And that's what they mean by the process of perception. And that's important if we want, there are people who've had brain injuries or diseases, and they lose that ability to assemble sense input into meaningful, into the world, and they actually lose connection with being able to interact with people and function in the world. So it's an important part of what we do. So the body, Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, perception. The fourth is what's called sankharas, and it has a huge range of meaning. But for our discussion now, we'll just put in all the other mental activity that's not included in the others and leave it at that. And then the last is consciousness itself, just pure consciousness. And the reason they sometimes will deconstruct what it is to be a human being this way, it's meant to be, I don't hold it as an ontological truth about what we are. I hold it as a skillful means to look at the experience of our own being to free our mind from clinging. Because we have a self. It's a misunderstanding in that people think Buddhism says there's no self. I don't want to get into that one tonight, but I'm happy to discuss with any of you. It's a mistranslation of the word we translate as self. Anatta does not mean no self, but we're kind of stuck with the word. But of course you have a self. The question is, what's the nature of yourself? And what we come to know, this is the insight into no self, is that it's all a changing process. And that's in service so we don't cling. And we know letting go of clinging is going back to our discussion last night. What do we mean by liberation through non-clinging? Well, if you're clinging to some fixed view of yourself, one of these aggregates, let's just say you're identified with the body and your youth. Well, that's not a reliable refuge for happiness. Because what's going to happen? We get older and our bodies age, and we talk about this over and over. But and we know it's true. The problem is, for so many of us, we don't live our lives as if it's true. So if we're clinging and then things inevitably change, we suffer. This is just basic dharma. But if we're seeing that it's nothing going wrong, this is just what happens with bodies. Things change. This is what happens with all experiences. Then we're able to hold it more spaciously. We don't get so upset. And it actually goes back to the quote I read, it was either last night or the night before, from Goenka, when he said, real wisdom is recognizing that all experiences are impermanent. And I don't have the exact quote, but he basically says, realizing that this is the way things are, then we don't get upset by ups and downs because we just see it's just the way life is. And then through that, we're able to live more quantumously and peacefully. This is the Dharma, the liberation through non-clinging. So, sorry, I got distracted. Thank you for the tip to spotlight myself for the recording. I did do that. So this is the use, and why it's valuable to use the model of the 5 aggregates. Can be one, there's many other models we can use also. They're all different ways to get a handle on our experience and to help kind of unpack and loosen the grip of our clinging to ourselves or any experience. Okay. So you don't remember, you don't need to know the details, but just you kind of have an idea of the 5 aggregates. The Dharma talk that's considered to be the 3rd one the Buddha ever gave is called the Fire Sermon. And it basically goes through our experiences, all our experiences, whether it's something you're seeing or hearing or taste, touch, what goes on in your mind. And through all of these experiences, the Buddha says those experiences are on fire. So it's just using that as a analogy, an image. And he says they're on fire. We're burning with greed, hatred, and delusion. And I think it can feel that way, can't it? Isn't that true? Sometimes when we're really, certainly when it's strong, there's a strong craving for something or a strong aversion to something. I remember when this is, I don't know, years and years ago, I drive a Prius. It's about 15 years old now. But when I first got it, the car I was driving before was perfectly fine. I wasn't thinking about cars. And then it was starting to have some problems. I got it repaired and gave it to my daughter. And it's time to get a new car. I thought, okay, I'm going to get a Prius. And that's when they were newly coming out. And you know, I was going about my business, not bothering anybody. All of a sudden, I'm noticing Priuses everywhere. And this was back when you had a 2-month wait to get one. So for 2 months, I'm craving a Prius. I don't know what I thought was going to happen when I got it. Like I was going to come into some great state of bliss and fulfillment or something. When I get this great thing, it's going to be great. Yes, when I got the car, it was nice. I appreciated it. I still do appreciate it. I think it was a fine car. But the real thing that happened when I got it was I didn't go into this transcendent state of bliss. It just took the craving away, and it was a great relief, and I was more back to normal. So that was an example. For those 2 months, I just was kind of agitated. I wasn't at peace. I couldn't wait to get the car. It just wasn't a balanced, a stable place to be. Being on fire may be a little strong, but I think the image is that when we suffer, when we're craving, and craving takes the form of getting away from or pushing away unpleasant experiences that we can't handle, or holding on or chasing after pleasant. And then the delusion is just when it's kind of an ignorance when we don't see clearly. So he's saying we're burning on fire with this. So a lot of it is putting out the fires. That's the Fire Sermon. The second discourse the Buddha attributed to the Buddha is a teaching on not self. And in that one, the Buddha goes through the 5 aggregates. This is the reason I wanted to bring in the concept so we all knew what it was. And again, he goes through the list of all the 5 aggregates, and he's talking to some of the monastics, and he says, you know, one by one, are these permanent or impermanent? And they give it's a good teaching story. They say, well, they're impermanent. And he said, well, if you cling to something, paraphrasing, if you cling to something that's going to change, is that for your welfare? Or is it going to cause you suffering? They say, well, it's going to cause you suffering. And he goes on to say, therefore, we should let go of our clinging around these things. And he says, when we view our own being, these 5 aggregates, when we view them in this way, it leads to this interesting word called nibbida, which is sometimes translated as disgust. But I think a better translation you'll hear is, it has the feeling of had enough, you know, and it basically means, you know, I've been trying to find my happiness in setting up conditions to my liking. I've been doing that my whole life. And how well has that been working out for me? You know, sometimes it works out okay and sometimes it doesn't. But I've really found for myself that the places of deeper satisfaction or well-being, and you can have to look for your own self about this, for me, have really come from a place of the deepening of non-clinging. And I used a phrase the other day, resting in the stream of non-clinging. So that's a phrase I use. If you don't relate to that, that's fine. Find your own way to articulate it. Rather than getting what I want or don't. And the peace of non-clinging, it's subtler than the happiness that comes from satisfying desires, but it's actually much more deeply satisfying, I find. So that's kind of the idea of letting go of the clinging around, or seeing clearly into the nature of the five aggregates of our own self, our own being. And then through that, we kind of can say, you know what, I'm turning in a different direction. That's kind of the nibbida. And then through the nibbida, it said we reach a place called, that's dispassion is what they say. And someone just said a text, what is the word for enough? Well, I'm just taking the word nibbida and saying it means kind of had enough. I don't know a particular Pali word for enough. I'm a little rusty on my Pali, so sorry about that. But I was just saying that's the sense of nibbida. And if we do that, it can lead to what's called dispassion. And then we rest in an equanimity. Got to pause here for a minute. What do we mean by dispassion? That English word has a lot of different connotations. And it can mean, if we're dispassionate, we don't feel any emotions. We're just kind of not numbed out, but just dull and kind of just still and not much happening. There's not an excitement there. There's not an aliveness. It can have that connotation. But actually, when you tease apart what does dispassion mean, dis and passion, it just means we're not entangled in the passions. And, you know, what is it like when we're caught up in a lot of passion? We don't see clearly. If you've ever, I don't know, for example, been in love, it's been a long, long time, but I have had that experience before when I was young. And it wasn't a very comfortable, stable place because, first of all, for a number of reasons, but one thing is there's the positive of being in love. I don't mean that. Please don't go off onto that. Of course, it can be beautiful. But, you know, you're in a new relationship and, you know, it colors your perception. Everything about the person can be wonderful. And then maybe in 2 or 3 months when the initial high wears off and you sort of come back to a more longer term stability, your perception is not colored by the passions as much. Maybe some of those things that you used to find endearing are now annoyances, for example. I don't know, but you get the idea that we can have our perceptions colored by, it's like another word being enchanted, and we can, sometimes they'll say you become disenchanted. And they don't mean let down, which that can have that connotation. It means not caught in an enchantment. Well, if you read the old fairy tales and the sorcerer casts a spell on someone, they're enchanted. They've lost connection or contact with normal reality. They don't see things as they are. And then if it's a good story with a happy ending, the spell is broken and they're back to reality. That's what's really meant by disenchantment, dispassion, seeing clearly the reality of things. And through that, then we can rest more equanimously with things as they are. We learn to let go and we kind of flow. I think equanimity is an important word. A lot of the different compilations of lists of teachings and practices all flow towards equanimity. That's another way to sum up the liberation through non-clinging. So we have fire sermon being on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion. The second discourse on not self, of not clinging to any of the aggregates as self. They are yourself, but we see that we don't cling to it. We just let ourselves be. And then the the talk that's the very first talk ascribed to the Buddha is called Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dharma. I want to pause here a bit too. It has two, this was the, according to, it's a beautiful story of when the Buddha comes back to people, his old buddies, the 5 ascetics he used to practice ascetic practices with. And he almost died, and then he did that for a number of years. He felt for himself that it wasn't getting him what he wanted. He went off and had his enlightenment, and then he came back and taught the 5 ascetics. And through his teachings, they became the 5, in addition to the Buddha, the 5 arahants, fully liberated, fully enlightened ones. And in that first talk, there are 2 parts. He teaches the middle way and the 4 noble truths. Middle way is basically a path between overindulgence in sense pleasures on one hand and asceticism on the other hand, that the path kind of has a middle way there. And then the second part is the teaching on the 4 noble truths. And this is what I want to spend a little time on because it informs how we work with samadhi and insight. So the word that's translated as suffering in the 4 noble truths is the word dukkha. Suffering is the word probably most people use. If the etymology of the word actually has the meaning of the wheel of a cart that's out of round, or maybe it's the axle itself that's out of round as you're going in a cart. And so what is it when you're riding in a cart where the wheel's not balanced or it's out of round? You get a bumpy ride. And so and the word I personally like better than suffering is either unreliable, or even better to me is unsatisfactory. So it certainly includes suffering, but all experiences are said to be dukkha, even pleasant ones. So, and there are times when, look, we're all having pleasant experiences. There's no suffering there. You're enjoying yourself. It's the clinging that creates the suffering. So one way to hold the word dukkha is there's an inherent unsatisfactoriness in any experience we can possibly have. It certainly can be satisfying in the moment, but if we cling to it, then when it inevitably changes, then the dukkha is suffering because we're holding on. That's the idea about dukkha. So if we hold that understanding, then as a shorthand, I'll just use the word suffering. I think as long as we understand what we're talking about. So the 4 noble truths are that the first noble truth is there is a truth of dukkha, of suffering caused by clinging. So but it's not just suffering, but it's due to clinging. That's what the first noble truth says. The second noble truth is that what causes the clinging? It's, some people think it's desire, but it is not desire. It's a particular kind of desire in Pali, tanha, which is translated as thirst. It's craving. Healthy desire is important. If you didn't desire to practice, if you didn't desire to move along this beautiful Dharma path, you wouldn't do it. Wholesome desire is good. It's craving. That's the second noble truth. And then the third noble truth, there is a cessation of that craving. And the fourth noble truth, which of course leads to a cessation of the clinging. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which is the path of practice, leading to the end of the craving. That's the 4 noble truths. Again, if you don't know it, it's not about memorizing this stuff. Just get the ideas to kind of come in and just let them go out of your mind. Here's what's important to remember about that. In the first noble truth, it goes through all this, talks a lot about, this is suffering, that's suffering. And then it says, and here's how you sum it all up. In summary, and I'm going to give you the Pali because it's short. You don't have to know the Pali, but so you understand, then I'll tell you the English. It's this little phrase called Panchupadana Kanda Dukkha. And it means the panch is 5. Upadana is clinging. Kanda, aggregates, 5 aggregates, clinging, dukkha or dukkha. The 5 aggregates goes back to the second discourse on no self. Just like the Buddhist, yes, that was the second one, a no self. If we're clinging to the aggregates, it's suffering. So it's right there. But this is an interesting piece. It's often, that phrase is often translated in a way that I find very awkward. Almost everybody translates it as the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. What does that mean? The 5 aggregates of clinging. Something's not, we get the meaning kind of, doesn't really make sense. Until we realize that the word upadana, yes, it means clinging, it also means the fuel from a fire, going right back to the fire sermon, when we're on fire. And so I want to offer, I didn't originate this idea, it actually came from Richard Gombrich, a great Sanskrit and Pali scholar who wrote a book, What the Buddha Thought. It's different from the book, What the Buddha Taught. This is what the Buddha thought. And he pulled this together in one of his chapters, which I thought was brilliant. I really feel like a better interpretation is, remember that khandhas, the 5 aggregates, are sometimes called the 5 heaps. Think of them as the fuel that's on fire, because that's what upadana means. It means the fuel for a fire. In addition to clinging, it means the fuel for a fire. You could say it has 2 different meanings, or you could say clinging is the fuel for the fire of the suffering, right? The Buddha said that explicitly in the fire sermon. So the way I think of the 4 Noble Truths is, I translate it in my mind is, when the 5 aggregates, those 5 bundles of fuel are on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion, we're suffering. And the whole practice we can think of is cooling out, putting out the fires. And when you hold it like that, it simplifies everything down. If there's some reactivity, the greed is a euphemism, meaning we're chasing after or holding on, wanting mind, something pleasant. The hatred is a euphemism. It can feel like hatred sometimes, but any aversion, pushing away, either I want to get that away from me or I want to get away from it. So whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, we're going toward it or away from it. And the delusion, again, is just, we're just kind of confused, or it can manifest in many ways, not clear. Putting those fires out. And then the question is, what is our experience of ourselves, our own being, the 5 aggregates? When the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion are cooled out, and we're just in this place of the aliveness of our being. Every one of us knows those times. We've all had, hopefully, a lot of times where in this time or in this moment, we're not caught in greed, hatred, or delusion, and we're just in harmony with the flow of ourselves and of life. Oftentimes, we don't even notice those times because they seem so just ordinary, and we may miss those moments and miss the appreciation for the actual equanimity that's present there. I call it becoming complacent, or just we consciously become a little unconscious or become asleep, because when things are either strongly to our liking or disliking, now that captures our attention. When things are kind of going along, we may just miss it, all right? Now, it is conditioned, because all it takes is the right causes and conditions to come together. We're caught again. So that's the work we're doing, is not only putting out the fires in the moment, but uprooting the seeds of potentiality that can sprout when the right conditions come together. And that gets back to something I talked, it may have been the first night of the talk, when I gave an example of when I was, one of my intentions and aspirations is to live in a way that my heart never closes off, ever, for any living beings or any situation. And that I was actually, some of you heard this talk, I was in a situation where I was actually chanting the metta, the loving kindness discourse, which is this beautiful poem about loving all beings. And in the middle of it, somebody did something that annoyed me. And in my mind, while I'm chanting, I did this silently, not out loud, but I turned to them, and my mind is chanting all this love. And then it just turned to them and just said, asshole. And then came right back and picked up the chant again, loving all beings unconditionally. And then once I woke up out of the trance about 10 seconds later and realized what happened, I saw the gift of what had happened. Because there was the seed, as I'm saying, the potential for the unwholesome state to sprout, to germinate. But I didn't know that was in there, and it got revealed that somebody just does a little annoyance, so whereas my mind goes someplace it's not so nice. So that person did me a favor. That moment was my teacher. And so this is why we want to start, we don't have to go digging, but we want to stay open and receptive. So when the present moment shows us a place where the fire, where we are on the fire, part of the five aggregates, our own being, our mind, our reactivity, is caught in the greed, hatred, and delusion, then we can use that as, I like to think of it as enlightenment training, rather than, what a bad Dharma practitioner I am, because it's happened again for the 10,000th time. I like to hold it as, because it just gets subtler and subtler. So it's still showing me places. Because in my mind, and I bet I share this with a lot of you, I don't want to be mostly non-reactive, but it's okay to be snappy and irritable and reactive over here. No, I want to take it as far as I can. I don't want to stop and say, well, my heart's going to stay open here, but it's okay to close off to you folks over there. Anyway, that's just for me. I want to know, I want to see. And so again, we don't have to go digging, but these present ourselves. And so this leads me to, someone said I was gone for a few moments, where maybe the video hung up. I was just saying we want to stay open and receptive. So when life, as our teacher, presents an opportunity to see some of these conditioned patterns that can lead to greed, hatred, and delusion, that's the fire, then we can have the right relationship with it and hold it with wisdom, which is saying, oh, I need that teacher to show me, right? And so we're appreciative. We don't go looking for it. We want to still set up the conditions of our life to go how we want, but we want to be open and ready for whatever life does give us. And so that brings me to the second part of what I want to get to tonight then. I want to talk about what is called purification of mind. I don't hear that a lot in sort of the insight meditation scene. Maybe it gets talked about, I just miss it, but I don't hear it a lot. So I want to shine a light on it. And related to that is what I call cycles of purity and purification. And as I talk about it, I'm going to tie it back to our discussion about samadhi, because what I'm about to say are natural fruits without you, as I said, you don't have to go digging and looking. Through the power of the samadhi, it has a purification of mind process to it. It also supports the insight, as I'll discuss tomorrow night. And it sort of cooks us in these cycles of purity and purification. So let me say what I mean when I say cycles of purity and purification. Sometimes we're meditating, and as we all know, there's some, we have what we call it's not accurate. We call them the good sits, there's the bad sits, but we know what we mean, right? There's the sits where the body's at ease, the mind, we're deep in the meditation, it's beautiful, we're clear, we're steady, we're present, the heart's open in love, however it manifests. And then you get up, you go to your walking period, you come back, and maybe, who knows, the next sit, body hurts, mind's irritable, can't concentrate. And we think it's all falling apart. And we sometimes think, well, what went wrong? And we have to realize that actually nothing went wrong. First of all, things change due to causes and conditions. And it's not like one of these meditations is better than another. It's just what is happening in the moment, and it's our opportunity then to work with that. That's the essence of the practice right there. And so that naturally happens on its own. But especially as we start deepening, these cycles can feel like they're getting stronger. And but it's a natural part of the process. So I want to give you an image about purifying gold. I don't know if this is actually how gold purification works, but the image works. So imagine that you've got a pot, a cauldron there, whatever they call it, of gold, the metal, and you've heated it so it's melted, and you see the pure, shiny gold. We're in the purity. Through doing that and cooking it, the impurities are now allowed to come up to the surface. And now what happened to the shiny gold? All looks gunky and you don't see the gold anymore. But because it's come up, we now can skim it off. We've removed some of the impurities and we see the shiny gold again. And it's more of a pure gold. Keep cooking it over time. Maybe it's subtler, but another layer of the impurities can rise and so on. You get the idea. And now we've lost the shiny gold and we skim that off. And so it's kind of like that in the practice. It can feel like that we, kind of like what I said, sometimes just by being in the practice, not just because what I said earlier was things change due to causes and conditions. And that is true. Even if it wasn't a purification process, just because of, if you sit long enough, the energies are going to change in your body, or you get hungry or you're tired, and just all kinds of changes that can happen in the ups and downs of our meditation. But there's also this other purifying process that is happening. It's the purification of mind. And it does tend to go in cycles. I don't know if, but you'll find over the course of your practice. And so I like that image because if you can remember the next time you're suffering, and don't worry about the times you can't remember. You'll get caught in it. Okay, you're going to suffer during those times. We learn. And yeah, it can be suffering when we forget, for sure. And we need a lot of compassion for those times when we can't see the way out, when we're lost in it and caught in it. And even the times when we can see and we still may not be able to find the way out, eventually we will, but it can feel that way sometimes. But when we can wake up and know what's happening, just in a simple way, it's nothing mystical here, just to know, oh, it was this way before. The mind can be so beautiful. If you don't already know this, I want to let you know that as you continue your meditation practice, you will, guaranteed, you will discover places in your own heart and mind that perhaps you had no idea how beautiful your heart and mind could be. And they're essential aspects of your being that you're touching into. They're really part of your truth. That's going to happen. Maybe you're in a space like that. You're sitting and it's like that. But then when it inevitably changes, rather than clinging back to that, we just recognize either that it's changed or that, oh yeah, this is and especially if it gets really some difficulties come up, maybe some emotional places come up or some old patterns, or you remember something from your childhood or some kind of wounding or trauma, it just can take many, many forms, is really alive now. You're in the purification now. And something else is needed, maybe. Sometimes we just stay with our breathing, we bring the mindfulness to it. Oftentimes that's enough. And if we're able to stay present and be with something without getting buffeted by it, be able to hold it in a kind of a spacious awareness or presence, that's fine. Maybe that's all you need. But part of our learning is what are the tools in our toolkit we need in order to work with all the range of things that can happen. So there may be times when something else is needed. Maybe you turn to some of these loving kindness or compassion practices for yourself. Maybe you need to do some inquiry work, all right? Really feeling down. I'm putting it into words, but it could be a nonverbal feeling. You could think it through too. That has a place. Sometimes I think thinking and thoughts gets a bad rap, and probably because we probably all think too much. But it has a place to think through things verbally in the mind, can serve us very well. We tend to shy away because people tend to overdo it. But we don't want to throw that approach out either if it serves us. But other times we might feel into it. And I'm going to say it in words, but it may be just a feeling of like, well, what is this place? Or this anger or this fear, and it keeps coming around. It's not just one time. And I'll give you another example for myself. We all have what I call our top 10 tunes, which are our main patterns or main areas in which we suffer. And we all probably share many in common. We all have our own version. One of mine, probably really predominant through my youth and well into my 20s, was around some self-esteem issues. And, that can take many, many forms. And there was a lot of self-doubt and despair and feeling like, I'm not lovable, I'm not likable. And it took a lot of forms of just not feeling okay about myself. And it was emotionally crippling. And actually, I would say so strong that I despaired of ever really being free from this. That's not really, I don't know if you've had a certain wound I don't know the answer, if you can get to a place as if that place had never been in you in the first place. Like you may have, if you and I don't share a particular one of the top 10 tunes, I may be completely liberated and just be free around an issue that you really struggle with, because it's just not my issue. And you may be completely free and it's just no consequence at all. It's not even part of your awareness around an area that I really struggle in. So I may not be able to get as free as you are, let's just say self-esteem in whatever way you relate to that, if that's not your issue. But I will say over the years, it's kind of evaporated away. And it took, I did psychotherapy work, but I really attribute a lot of it to the Dharma practice also, of the purification process that can happen. And it really took a lot of years when at one point I finally looked back and realized it's like, wow, I completely forgot about that. Was such a dominant part in my life. And I haven't thought, it just hasn't even been opera. It doesn't come up for me for years. Wow, that's just amazing. That's an example. It doesn't mean I don't have other places. We're all human beings and we have our areas where we can still suffer and be reactive. I don't know what that might be if we reach this thing called the end of the path. But certainly that's an example of something that's kind of mostly just kind of liberated. Well, what happened there? This purification process, going into these meditative states, so there's the cycles of purity and purification. And I mentioned that because we want to be aware. We don't have to be, hyper vigilant about it, but just to know when things change, it could be the cycling. And then we can hold it as saying, oh, this is the process. And it allows us to hold it more skillfully and more kindly. It's kind of like Rumi's poem, The Guest House, which I know many of you are familiar with. If not, look up that poem, The Guest House. It's worth reading many times. But besides the issue of the cycles, just this process of purification of mind, when we touch into these states, certainly the samadhi states, because they're really beautiful states of mind, as we're going to explore, continue talking about. They touch us into places that have all I can say is there's some, I don't know really what, but it's a profound shift that can happen just by touching into those states. Even if we're not doing mindfulness practice, even if we're not doing insight meditation, just by going to those states alone is powerful. Now, of course, we need to bring in all the other pieces too around the insight practices. Like I said, we're going to get to all that discussion, the mindfulness, the heart practices and all that. We need to bring all of those in because they all have their pieces to contribute. They're each a facet. How would you say in this beautiful jewel? Each is a facet that creates the whole beauty. It's like, it's not a bad image, if you have this beautiful diamond and, if one side was cut beautifully, but you just kind of chunked off the other side, it really wouldn't be so beautiful. So we want to bring all those pieces in as various facets. So the purification really is something we want to give a lot of credence to. Now, so sometimes people will, when they get into these states of jhana, and I'm going to talk about them, I think that'll be Wednesday night. And then they'll say, well, what do I do now? I don't want to get into that now, but there's a lot of things you can aim in these different directions and look for insights and everything. And sometimes the answer is you just hang out. And that has a place too, because of this purification, this process of cooking us or ripening us. So there's that aspect. But then also these concentration practices, because the mind is so steady and clear and present, and there's a feeling of the awareness is brightened. Our perception becomes so finely tuned. And when it happens, it'll just be obvious to you if you haven't experienced it. Sometimes people say, well, what is he talking about? But it's like just the way your perception, everything's brighter and clearer. And I think I said, if I didn't, it bears repeating, that sometimes in samadhi, it can feel like the mind is turned into a Hubble telescope, the power of it. And the flip side is it can feel like it's turned into an electron microscope, which is more in the other direction. But that's the power of our perception. And so in addition to the purification, that power of the samadhi carries through. So when we're doing the insight, when we feel like we're on the insight side of the practice, we have so much more, the tools at our disposal, the insights go deeper and we're clearer because we're so undistracted in our perception. And so that's the other way that samadhi feeds over into the insight side. Someone just sent me a question about saying this again about the guest house. It's a poem by Rumi, and I think it's titled The Guest House. Just do a web search on it. You'll find it. It's not a long poem, but it's quoted many, many times in the Dharma world because it's so short, but I think it gets to the essence of a lot of aspects of practice. As we're moving forward, talking about the samadhi, talking about the insight, the last piece, we're getting towards the end of our talk, the last piece that we should always come back to, and I know I say this a lot, I've actually gotten some feedback, I keep repeating it. The reason is that I think it's so important and we often forget. If you don't remember anything, just start to train yourself to remember. Very simple. What's actually going on right now? What's needed for this? Not what I think it's supposed to be, not how can I get more concentrated, just what is happening now? And so I just want to share this last piece for you from the leading edge of my own practice. I think I think we all appreciate formal meditation training, or you wouldn't be doing a retreat like this. And so I have a lot of respect and appreciation for the power. I think it really is important, the formal times of practice. And I still to this day have my daily practice, and I don't know what would happen. All these years I've meditated, I have no idea. I haven't done the experiment. What would happen if I stopped? I just don't know that. So I see the value there. And I used to think the leading edge of my practice was as the formal meditation itself kept opening. And it can still keep opening in some wonderful, powerful ways. But for me, the leading edge of my own practice is more when I get up from my meditation and I just move about in my daily activities through my daily life. When I'm not in some samadhi and whatever, the power of, I really consider that a place where basically my practice has gotten very, very simple. I'll just offer it to you if it's useful for you. During the times when I'm resting in that current of non-clinging and my heart's not closed off, I don't do anything. I just live. I don't want to fall into the trance about it. I want to know what's happening. And that awareness, as many of you know, does grow through the practice without even having to try. You just are, mindfulness in daily life can be a practice. But also mindfulness in daily life can be a fruit of the practice, where it's a result of all this formal training. And then we see that wakefulness carries through naturally more and more. So you can be more aware. It's not that you never space out, but less. Then you know the times when you're in a good place. You're not clinging. You're in harmony. You're not in a conflict with yourself or with your experience. Heart's not closed off. You can know that, appreciate it, and live. And then during the times when my heart does close off, or I've gotten caught in some kind of reactivity, my practice is very simple. Let go, open the heart. Let go, open the heart. That's it. It's not complicated. Sometimes it's complicated what to do if we don't know. Very, very simple. Live when, and so during the times when you're not in any conflict and you're in the flow, maybe the way to frame it isn't what's needed now, because maybe nothing's needed. You just recognize it and you live, not in an unconscious way. When there's some difficulty, then we may need to know, well, how do I open my heart right now, and how do I let go? And that's the learning we're all going through. I think for all of us, through experience in our practice, the ability to, first of all, not be caught in the trance of the moment and to know what's happening carries through more and more. And then the ability, just when we see it, just to, we don't even know how, but we can let go in the mind. We can open the heart in a way that's not fake, that's genuine, strengthens. So we appreciate that and use that. And there are still maybe times when we have to bring in more tools to help us. And so there are those times too. So it's, in that way, just as in sitting meditation, I'm offering and proposing one way to hold it is there's just what's happening in the present moment and what's needed. Well, it's the same thing in daily life as we go about our business. It's really the same thing. What is the present moment truth? How am I relating to the present moment? Be relaxed. You don't want to be hypervigilant. And then let life be our teacher. Someone once said to me, what would it be like if we saw every person, every situation as our teacher? And I may have offered this the other night, I don't remember, about an experiment you can take on for yourself to consciously frame it that way, even if you do it half an hour, 5 minutes, or part of a day, or you may find it shifts your relationship with everything. And it may not necessarily change the choices that you make in your response, but the attitude of mind you bring, if we can meet any moment with less reactivity and more of a sense of stability of mind and equanimity, then we've got a better chance to make a wise response rather than just a reaction. So I'll stop here. I want to thank you and give you some appreciation for your kind attention. Let's sit quietly just for a few breaths, and then I'll ring a bell to end.